Libido Dominandi by E. Michael Jones. Part 1, Chapter 7. Paris, 1821. 1 year after Abbe Barriel's death, and 1 year before Shelley's, on May the 3rd, 1821, a young man by the name of Auguste Comte was walking through the Palais Royal, enjoying the weather and admiring the young couples walking along its paths, when a young woman caught his eye. Her name was Caroline Massin, and she was used to catching the eye of strolling young men. She was, in spite of her fresh looks, a prostitute, although the young man did not know that at the time. He got her address and asked if he could see her again. Comte was 5 months younger than Mary Godwin, having been born on January 19, 1798, or the first day of Pleuvois in the year 6, since France, then under the rule of Napoleon, still reckoned that time began with the founding of the French Republic. Comte's parents were ardent Catholics and Royalists, and wanted their child to be baptized, but the churches had been closed since 1793, and the baptism of children was still against the law. Even if his parents were devout Catholics and Royalists, Comte was very much a child of the French Revolution. If his parents wanted to transmit the Catholic faith to their child, they did so, but not in the way they most probably had hoped. Comte was a devout anti-revolutionary, and his philosophical system, which came to be known as positivism, came into being as a reaction to the revolutionary chaos of his youth. By the time Comte reached manhood, he had lived under 4 separate governments, and had seen his country, the most powerful in Europe when his parents had been born, ravaged by bloodthirsty mobs of Frenchmen and marauding foreign armies. Comte and his fellow high school students formed their own military brigade to defend the motherland against the invading Russian army, and on March the 30th, 1814, the Russian dragoons marched into towns and dispersed them, like the schoolboys that they were. 20 students were wounded, and a number were also taken prisoner. Yet Comte, for all his hatred of Napoleon and the Revolution, couldn't accept the religion of his parents, and this meant he couldn't become part of the resistance movement like Dominandi. Comte was an atheist by the age of 14, having rejected both Catholicism and the Revolution, the only 2 political forces in France at the time. Comte would go on to fashion a philosophy and ultimately a religion, which was a weird combination of both. Positivism might be called the Church of the Enlightenment, and through it, Comte attracted a following that would make a significant contribution toward turning sociology, in the broader sense of the term, which is how Comte intended it, into a system of control, which would become the world's dominant regime by the end of the 20th century. Aldous Huxley would call Comte's positivism, quote, Catholicism minus Christianity, end quote. And in this it was similar to Weishaupt's appropriation of Jesuit spirituality in the service of Freemasonry. Both men took what they found appealing in the Catholic Church and ripped it out of its matrix and introduced it to a radically different context, which changed its meaning completely. Both took what were essentially mechanisms of self-control based on Catholicism's understanding of the moral order, and turned them into essentially heteronymous instruments of social control, whose goal was the betterment of, quote, humanity, end quote, and whose validating principle was, quote, science, end quote. Herbert Crowley, who had been baptized into Comte's Church of Positivism by his Irish newspaper man father in the 1880s in America, would go on to implement Comte's idea as editor of the New Republic, which, among other things, would orchestrate America's entry into World War I and the subsequent rise of the American Empire. Domestically, Crowley and the New Republic were avid supporters of Watsonian behaviorism and advertising, which meant the creation of national markets, which would in turn extinguish ethnic loyalty and local government in the interest of national consensus that had much in common with the general will so praised by French revolutionaries. Crowley and the New Republic also supported John Dewey's attempt to turn the public school system into a national entity whose main goal was not the transmission of skills, but the inculcation of attitudes they found congenial to national consciousness and the general will. Comte almost went to America himself. In preparation for his trip, he immersed himself in the language and political thought of what he thought was going to be his new home. But at the last moment the job fell through, and he became secretary to Claude-Henri Saint-Simon instead. It was from Saint-Simon that he would make contact with what Marx and Engels would later call utopian socialism, or critical utopian socialism. Like Saint-Simon, Comte's intellectual trajectory was the result of a parallelogram of intellectual and cultural forces, which involved revolution and Catholicism. Both lived to see the disillusioned aftermath of the revolution that failed, yet neither was able to return to the Catholic social order which preceded the revolution. The same was true of Charles Fourier, another utopian socialist, closer in age to Comte. With the dissolution of the Ancien regime, morals were cast adrift. Revolutionary appeals to, quote, virtue, end quote, Comte's generation had learned, invariably meant murder in some form or another, and the utopian socialists were realistic enough to see that the revolution didn't lead to any improvement in France. In fact, to a large extent, it had blighted their lives. Of the three, Saint-Simon was the least affected because he was the most revolutionary. Having fought alongside George Washington in the campaign against Cornwallis on the Yorktown Peninsula, Saint-Simon returned to play a leading role in the French Revolution and lived to see the dreams he espoused go up in smoke when Napoleon declared himself emperor, and then went on to defeat at the hands of the Russians. Fourier was 12 years younger than Saint-Simon, and even more so than Comte, who was 20-some years his junior. Fourier's life was ruined by the upheaval of the revolution caused. Each man in his way saw the passions which the revolution aroused spin out of control. Each man saw the mechanism whereby the passion could be brought under control, and yet each man was incapable of placing faith in the tradition which preceded the Enlightenment, the movement which had brought about the revolution in the first place. It was from Saint-Simon that Comte got the idea that industrialism was to be the new form of social order that would replace the old order which had been swept irrevocably away by the revolution. The new order was to be based on science and the now discredited religion, because no one could argue with science, which, as Shelley has said, was based on fact, not hypothesis. Quote, hypothesis non fingo, end quote, Newton had written, and Shelley had quoted that passage in a footnote to Queen Mab, as the marching orders of the new man would bring about heaven on earth. To substantiate Shelley's revolutionary pedigree, Friedrich Engels would arrange to have Queen Mab translated and distributed during the Revolution of 1848. Saint-Simon's idea of heaven on earth meant using the factory, or phalanstery, as the basis of social order. Young people of both sexes were to be interned in factories, where they would produce useful goods, be kept under control, and be diverted from any idea of rebellion by the sexual attraction which co-workers of the opposite sex would exert over them. It was, in Nuce, the workplace of the late 20th century, and it was the first concrete proposal of how to use sex as a form of political control by integrating it into the emerging factory system. Comte entered into a sexual relationship with Caroline Massin shortly after he met her in 1821. 1 year later, Comte issued the pamphlet, quote, Plan for Scientific Studies, demanded by the reorganization of society, end quote, published in 1822. 3 years later, he issued an expanded version of that pamphlet, with Massin's assistance as editor, under the title System of Positive Polity. That book was in effect the core of his ideas, and the core of the 6 volumes of the Cours de Philosophie Positive, and the 4 even heavier volumes of the Système de Politique Positive, added only details to the original idea. On February the 19th, 1825, which is to say around the time his most important work was published, Comte married Massin in civil ceremony at the city hall of the 4th arrondissement in Paris. From the outside, it might have seemed to be the consolidation of his personal and intellectual life, but there was evidence that looks were deceiving. To give one such instance, the witness for the bride was a certain M. Seclet, one of the first and best customers. The marriage did little to change the fact that Comte, for all his involvement in the laws of human society, could never be sure his wife was being faithful to him. She would disappear periodically and then return to his life as if nothing had happened, creating the nagging suspicion in his mind that she had returned to her previous métier, either for fun or profit. It may have been the insecurity which Massin's conduct engendered, which led Comte to his periodic bouts of insanity and ultimately to his suicide attempt. Comte eventually went to see Dr. Esquirol, the man who had shut down the Marquis de Sade's theatrical performances at Charenton, and Esquirol suspected that Massin was the cause of his problem, and that Comte would never leave Massin, was unable to cure Comte. Comte, however, associated his mental illness with Massin in a different way. Quote, "Now I will be cured because I am with her," end quote, is what he said as he picked him up in a cab from the hospital. Given her proclivities, however, any cure based on her faithful presence could only be considered temporary. Still suffering from the bouts of depression, Comte decided to take matters into his own hands, and in April of 1827, by throwing himself into the Seine and putting an end to his life. The minute he hit the cold water, however, he was struck by a profound desire to go on living, and was cured of his illness as well. The pathos of Comte's personal situation mirrors in many ways the lives of future reformers, who would also try to formulate the fundamentals of social organization, i.e. control, while in the throes of sexual passion. John B. Watson springs to mind. Physically plagued by sexual insecurity, Comte created by way of compensation a scientific universe that was unable to change. He rejected, for instance, the discovery of Neptune because that would mean that the laws of astronomical science were not complete at the time he had formulated the tenets of positivism. As a result, science could not provide the stability that the post-revolutionary order demanded. Quote, Comte's true ambition, end quote, according to his biographer, quote, lay in the scientific organization of society, the bringing about of a scientific heaven on earth. And what is heaven if not a perfect and definite order of things and conditions? End quote. Again, the pathos of his personal life of the great scientific reformer intrudes. Comte may not have been saved from incurable mental illness by love, but love had no place in the system he created to bring order to a revolutionary world which had spun out of control. The man who needed to be loved in order to be sane erected a system which had no place for love. Hence both he and his system were suffused with a pervasive air of insanity. The same could be said, mutatis mutandis, of the other utopian socialists. Like Comte, their project was born of the same need for order in the face of widespread social breakdown. Like Comte, they sought in science what the previous regime had sought in the church. Like Comte, Charles Fourier sought the antidote to revolution in the Enlightenment, which had caused the revolution in the first place, because he couldn't conceive of finding this solution any place else. Fourier based his social theories on a system which cast passion as the human equivalent of Newton's force of gravity. As a matter of fact, the opposite was sooner the case, since Fourier claimed that, quote, everything from the atom to the galaxies was an imitation of human passion, end quote. As a result of this reduction of the driving force of human life to the psychic equivalent of the subatomic particle, passion is alienated from the human soul, and reason is disinherited as the instrument which brings passion under control, being replaced by will, either individual or collective, as in the case of class interest. As a result, morality, which was traditionally reason's ability to apprehend the truth in the practical order, gets cut adrift from its rational matrix and forced to find a home in, quote, science, end quote. All arts now have to justify themselves as isses, since facts are the only validator in any positive system. When morals were cast adrift, sexual behavior was cast adrift with them. It was up to the utopian socialists to find a new home for sexual morals. Unfortunately, all of them shared the Enlightenment's essentially voluntarist view of morals, later adopted by the communists, which claimed that family, along with religion, was an engine of oppression created by the propertied classes to ensure their grip on the levers of power. Once passion was reduced to an abstract physical force like gravity, sexual morals become a function of broader forces as well, like the means of production, and as a result sexual, quote, customs, end quote, were to become fluid and a function of something other than the moral determination of the people who got married. In this, Fourier had much in common with the critique of Marx and Engels, who pretty much adopted what he had to say. By locating marriage and the family in a matrix of economic forces, Fourier and the Marxists placed, quote, liberation, end quote, at the center of family life. Given their economic premises, certain sexual conclusions were unavoidable. If, for example, marriage was in its very essence asocial and based on the domination of women as property, then the only real criterion of genuine social liberation was the extent to which women could emancipate themselves from marriage. But what did that mean? Fourier is clear on the matter. Emancipation from marriage means the integration of women into the production process, which means, of course, getting a job in a factory. Once again, liberation upon closer inspection showed itself as a form of control. Women were to be delivered from tyranny of their husbands, only to be handed over to the tyranny of their bosses in the cotton mills, who now would exploit them for their profit. Le plus ça chance, as the French would say. There were other similarities as well, since marriage from the traditional point of view was synonymous with sexual morality. Then emancipation meant, quote, liberation, end quote, from the moral law. It was, in other words, the same Enlightenment formula, which had led to the revolution 50 years before. Therefore, it is not surprising that it should lead to revolution once again, which is what happened in 1848. Traditional French culture, already wearied by the revolution, proved resistant to utopian schemes during the 19th century. But America, already populated by a ruthless group of immigrants, whose very immigration showed that they were sympathetic to some form of social experimentation, soon became home to a number of utopian social communities, some of which were based on the French model, like Brook Farm, which Nathaniel Hawthorne immortalized in his novel The Blithedale Romance. All of them failed. In the fall of 1824, shortly before Comte married Caroline Massin, a Welshman by the name of Robert Owen, who had become famous in England for establishing a model factory and community in New Lanark, Scotland, arrived in America to start another, more ambitious community in New Harmony, Indiana. Whereas New Lanark had succeeded, New Harmony failed, and Owen, after trying to persuade the Mexican government to let him try to found a still more ambitious community on the banks of the Rio Grande, returned to England to figure out why it had failed. Marx concluded that the experiment had failed because of, quote, the deeply hidden conspiracy of the upper classes against the rights of the poor and the working class, end quote. When Owen suggested workmen's compensation and higher wages as a solution to the ongoing labor crisis in England, the Malthusians responded by saying that those measures would only lead to overpopulation. With the defeat of Owen and the moderate evolutionary approach of the utopian socialist, the field was left with only two major players: the Malthusians / Manchester School, defenders of the unjust status quo, and the Marxist proponents of revolution. With Marx's verdict on Owensfield's experiment, the world was ripe for revolution, and in 1848, as in France 60 years earlier, the revolution took place once again, and once again it failed. One of the participants this time around was a young conductor and composer by the name of Richard Wagner. Wagner had manned the barricades with Michael Bakunin in Dresden, and when the revolution of 1848 collapsed there, Wagner went into exile in Switzerland. Wagner used the opportunity to rethink his revolutionary priorities. His thoughts were published in a book called Art and Revolution, and in the process of writing that book, he changed from being an unsuccessful political revolutionary into being a very successful cultural revolutionary by the creation of an opera, Tristan and Isolde, and a new musical form, chromaticism, which would become the anthem for sexual liberation for the next 50 years. One of the people most affected by Wagner's Tristan was a young gymnasium student by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche, who dedicated his life thereafter, some said by deliberately infecting himself with syphilis, to promoting sexual passion as a form of cultural terrorism. By the latter half of the 19th century, when Victoria was still on the throne in England, and France had yet to recover from its revolution, sexual liberation was almost exclusively a German phenomenon. One centered largely around performances of Tristan and Isolde, as Thomas Mann, no stranger to sexual liberation himself, makes clear. By the turn of the 20th century, there were a number of small groups of people who devoted themselves to the writings of Nietzsche, which was Wagner's sexual liberation in a more toxic, philosophical form. In addition to Bayreuth, where the faithful could see Wagner performed each year, another place which drew those interested in sexual liberation and its Germanic rationalizations was the northern Italian resort of Ascona, where an ongoing German version of Woodstock was in session for the first decade of the 20th century. One of the famous habitués of Ascona during the period was the son of a policeman by the name of Otto Gross, a man characterized by Richard Knoll as, quote, the great breaker of the bond, the loosener, the beloved of any army of women he had ever driven mad. It is just for a short time. If just for a short time, sorry. He coaxed one lover/patient to suicide, and then another patient died under similar circumstances. His contemporaries described him as a brilliant, creative, charismatic, and troubled. His contemporaries described him as brilliant, creative, charismatic, and troubled. He was a Nietzschean physician, a Freudian psychoanalyst, and anarchist, the high priest of sexual liberation, a master of orgies, the enemy of patriarchy, and a dissolute cocaine and morphine addict. He was loved and hated with equal passion, an infectious agent to some, a healing touch to others. He was a strawberry blonde Dionysus, end quote. He was also an influence on C.G. Jung, even as his patient, and it was through Jung and Freud and the resurrection of Illuminism and psychoanalysis that we return to the main thread of our story. End of Part 1, Chapter 7, Libido Dominandi, by E. Michael Jones.